Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about, how do we not die tonight? It wasn't just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You're living in a tiny mud and stick hut, with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows, unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin. And definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything, the wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside, with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a couple of rough-spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't really work, and forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure, and bonus, some fleas for extra company. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, and honestly, worth celebrating. Maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure? It was just beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it was always readily available, shall we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants. They were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled close to each other. Human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart, and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of. If your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Maybe if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations. It was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. If you could afford it, or more realistically, if you could steal enough of it from your neighbour's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, got mouldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cosy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defence against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the centre of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing, or your overall lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty, stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cosy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and, voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong? Well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art, passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said use dry ash only, others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight, others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals, basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory, right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more, the merrier," wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth, each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbours, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was, don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared. A communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the centre, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and, undoubtedly, some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbour in the dead of night. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that. But it's a cow, it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells? Legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took centre stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious. First thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends, they were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple: if you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes, all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic, then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and, if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. and forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So, the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags, and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armour clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush featherbeds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds, in the medieval peasant world, were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw, and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious, ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew mouldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odour livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely, for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its finest. So, next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." Because in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors? Windows? If you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts, and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand, organised system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol, and since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warm-ish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod and curse the fire back to life, while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter, everyone pulled their weight, or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and, frankly, because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who, accidentally, rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes, and cold, begrudging hands, ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant, squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m, wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say, "Hail Mary," that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and, most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul, with no doctors in sight, and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning, but hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs, indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks, and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon: a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long, freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say, after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation. No artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal, designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly prized, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard. Peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the haybox, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realised if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better. Rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small, localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner. It was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime hearth real estate. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and, let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cosy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smouldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbour why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive, you're still warm, for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbour's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighbourhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbour would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pooled their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened. Disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed. A lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's frontline defence. Saint Blaise, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments. Not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous draughts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbour, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers and tucked under itchy blankets, that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine Winter of 1315, when rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and, in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience. It was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meagre warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbours would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic, it was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbours wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbours were already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold too. Starvation weakened the body, and cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror. Frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honour that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter, some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbour at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of endless winters. It's tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pool resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbour today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow, it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one more night, one more storm, future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely survive, until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights. All of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Imagine walking through a city over 4,500 years old and realizing it's laid out with more precision than some modern suburbs. Welcome to Mohenjo-Daro, the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you were expecting dusty huts and random alleyways, think again. This place was so well planned, it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro wasn't thrown together like a festival campsite. It was meticulously organized. The city was laid out in a grid pattern, yes, actual blocks and right angles. Streets ran north to south and east to west, intersecting cleanly and forming a neat network of roads. It was as if the architects used a ruler and said, "Let's keep this geometric." But the real magic wasn't just on the surface. Underneath those dusty roads was a system that even 21st century cities often fail to maintain: drainage. Mohenjo-Daro had an underground sewer system. Almost every house, no matter how small, had access to water and drainage. Wastewater flowed from homes into covered drains, running alongside the streets. You could almost hear the ancient residents saying, "Yes, actually, sanitation matters." The city wasn't just a giant bathroom with bricks, though. It was zoned with intention. There was a citadel on a raised mound, probably home to administrative or religious elites, and a lower city where the general population lived. Public buildings like the famed Great Bath suggest that this wasn't just about survival. There was ritual, maybe even recreation, soaked into the clay bricks. Markets likely thrived along the main streets, and houses varied in size, indicating social stratification, but even the modest homes had private wells and toilets. Let that sink in. People with fewer means still had indoor plumbing 4 millennia ago. Meanwhile, many 19th century Europeans were still throwing waste out of windows. And then, mystery. The city was eventually abandoned. No sign of conquest, no dramatic fire. Just silence. Perhaps climate shifts, perhaps trade disruption. But whatever the cause, the legacy of Mohenjo-Daro endures. A city built with intent, intelligence, and a disturbing awareness that clean water and zoning laws actually matter. And they didn't even have an urban planning department. Go figure. If Mohenjo-Daro was the tidy accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the theatrical celebrity. Flashy, vast, and drenched in myth, Babylon wasn't just a city. It was a symbol. It rose and fell many times over the centuries. But in its prime, around the 6th century BCE under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the glittering heart of Mesopotamia. Now, don't let the poetry fool you. This place was as carefully planned as it was majestic. Babylon was a walled city with massive gates, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate, adorned with dazzling blue tiles and sacred lions that looked like they belonged in a dream sequence. And no, it wasn't just decorative. That gate was part of a carefully orchestrated urban layout. At the centre of Babylon's design was a sacred axis, a processional way that ran straight through the city. This wasn't just a road, it was a parade route for gods. Literally. Religious festivals like the Akitu, New Year Festival, would process along this street, linking the great Etemenanke ziggurat, which may or may not have inspired the story of the Tower of Babel, to the mighty Esagila temple, dedicated to the god Marduk. Urban planning here was part piety, part propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked its holy narrative every day. Babylon's streets curved with the river and obeyed the land's contours, but they were also zoned smartly. There were residential quarters, temple complexes, gardens, markets, and administrative centres. The Euphrates River sliced through the city, providing not only water but also a navigable artery for trade, commerce, and, let's be honest, showing off. Drainage systems were present, though not quite as refined as in the Indus Valley. Still, homes had bathrooms with clay pipes and canals to move wastewater away. Babylonian engineers were clearly not amateurs. Even bricks bore inscriptions of the king's name, because if you're going to build sewers, you might as well brand them. Babylon was a city designed to impress both mortals and gods. Every street, every gate, every temple was a statement. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and marvel at the zoning permits. And people did. Even Alexander the Great reportedly planned to make Babylon his capital, because once you've walked down a street made for a god, Athens probably felt a bit underwhelming. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs marveled at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. This ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design skills. At its peak around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population north of 100,000. And unlike the chaotic sprawl of some modern megacities, this place was deliberately mapped out with the precision of a sacred geometry student who never forgot their protractor. The city's most iconic feature? The Avenue of the Dead. Despite its morbid name, thanks Aztecs, it was less a cemetery and more a ceremonial boulevard stretching over 2 miles. This grand avenue was no accident. It was a central axis, aligned with astronomical events and flanked by temples, plazas, elite residences, and bustling market zones. It connected the Pyramid of the Moon at the north with the enormous Pyramid of the Sun, creating a sacred spine that structured the entire city. Now here's where things get even more advanced. Teotihuacan's layout was orthogonal. The whole city followed a grid system, tilted about 15.5 degrees off true north, possibly to align with specific celestial phenomena or sacred mountains. It wasn't random, it was cosmological. This was urban planning with a cosmic compass. And zoning? Absolutely. Residential compounds were laid out in modular blocks, often housing multiple families with access to shared patios and drainage systems. Some compounds were highly decorated, indicating wealth, while others showed a more communal, working-class lifestyle. This wasn't just a city, It was organized society made visible in stone and stucco. Teotihuacan also had a complex water management system. Canals and drains ran alongside streets and through residential zones, helping to prevent flooding in the rainy season. Engineers clearly understood their environment and planned accordingly. You get the sense they would have been deeply offended by potholes. There's still much we don't know: who ruled, how power was structured. But we do know this: the city was built to impress both the eyes and the skies. Teotihuacan was a blueprint of order, combining ritual with rationality. And when the Aztecs stumbled upon its towering ruins centuries later, they didn't just admire it, they assumed gods must have built it. Honestly, after seeing the symmetry, who could blame them? When we talk about ancient urban planning, it's tempting to imagine a single mastermind, the ancient version of a city architect with a scroll and a vision. But in the Indus Valley civilization, it seems the planning came not from a ruler's decree, but from a cultural consensus so strong that multiple cities across the region, from Harappa to Lothal, share shockingly similar features. These weren't sister cities, they were practically architectural clones. And that says something profound. Take Harappa, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan. Like Mohenjo-Daro, it too was laid out in a grid-like pattern, with uniform brick sizes, clear zoning for industrial, residential, and administrative use, and, you guessed it, advanced drainage systems. Each home was connected to street drains via private chutes or underground terracotta pipes. This wasn't just sanitation. It was dignity by design, ensuring that even common citizens had clean facilities. Lothal, another Indus city near the Arabian Sea, added a new layer of sophistication: port planning. Yes, Lothal had a dockyard, possibly the earliest known in the world, complete with a massive basin and sluice gates to control water levels. This wasn't just a riverside outpost. It was a shipping hub with infrastructure that anticipated tides and flow patterns. And you thought Venice was clever. What makes it even more remarkable is that there's no evidence of kings, palaces, or military fortresses. No statues of ruling elites. No epic inscriptions boasting about victories. Instead, the cities seem to have been run by efficient bureaucracies or councils focused on hygiene, trade, and ritual. Their power came from engineering, not empire. Artifacts like standardized weights and measures suggest a deeply regulated economy, with designated market areas and craft zones. You could almost imagine ancient planning committees arguing over warehouse placement and sewer width, because these decisions were made, and they stuck, across hundreds of miles. And they weren't just building for the elite. The uniformity in home construction, access to water, and public amenities like baths and wells point to an urban ideal that was collective, not hierarchical. The real architects of the Indus cities weren't just building towns. They were shaping a society where order was embedded in every brick, and where planning wasn't a privilege. It was a principle. When we think of zoning today, we picture bureaucrats arguing over parking permits and whether someone's Airbnb violates residential codes. But zoning, dividing a city into designated areas for living, working, worshipping, and dumping your garbage, isn't modern. It's ancient and surprisingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random clusters of buildings. They were carefully orchestrated spaces, each with a logic behind the layout. Let's start with Mohenjo-Daro again. There, the raised citadel housed public baths, granaries, and possibly administrative buildings. Below it lay the residential quarters, with broad avenues separating them. Workshops and kilns were kept at the edges, probably because nobody wanted their home filled with smoke and clanging pottery wheels. It's zoning by common sense. But the impressive part is that this model repeated across Indus cities. Now jump over to Babylon. Babylonian zoning was driven not just by utility, but also by ritual and propaganda. Temples and palaces dominated the city's heart, linked by ceremonial routes. Administrative buildings and elite homes clustered nearby, while commoners and markets were pushed outward. But everyone, rich or poor, lived under the same city layout philosophy, organized, purposeful, and impressively sophisticated. Then there's Teotihuacan. Here, zoning reached almost surgical precision. The city's layout followed a strict grid, but each sector had a clear identity. There were residential compounds, craft production zones, market areas, and temple complexes, all coordinated like parts of a body. Some compounds even housed immigrants, entire neighborhoods of people from Oaxaca or the Gulf Coast, each built in the architectural style of their homeland. It was zoning plus multiculturalism, in 500 CE. This level of spatial organization shows one critical thing. These weren't just cities, they were intentional societies. Urban space reflected values, be they spiritual, political, or economic. Where you lived, where you worked, where you worshipped, these were all pre-mapped by people who understood not only how humans move, but how they relate. And no, they didn't need modern GIS software, just observation, engineering, and maybe a divine mandate or two. Because when a society can enforce zoning laws without Twitter outrage or lawsuits, you know their urban planning game was ahead of its time. We love to imagine the ancient world as gloriously filthy. Muddy streets, chamber pots, and the unmistakable perfume of unwashed crowds. But the truth? Some ancient cities cared a lot about sanitation. In fact, several had public hygiene systems that would make a 19th century European blush. Let's return to Mohenjo-Daro, our sanitation superstar. Nearly every house, regardless of size, had its own private bathing area, complete with a sloped floor to drain water. Wastewater was channeled into covered street drains. Yes, covered drains. Lined with bricks and equipped with access holes for cleaning. The drains ran along nearly every street, carrying waste away from the city. It was basically an early version of municipal plumbing. This was not just clever, it was revolutionary. Compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was more symbolic. The city had canals and some drainage channels, and clay pipes carried water into palaces and temples. But for the average citizen, sanitation involved cesspits, open ditches, and divine forgiveness. Still, bathrooms were common, and wealthier homes had indoor plumbing using clay piping. Some records even describe a rudimentary flushing system, likely involving buckets and good timing. Now let's zoom into Teotihuacan. Though not as obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley, Teotihuacan still featured carefully engineered stormwater canals and separate sewage systems in elite compounds. Many residential complexes had internal drains, and public buildings often had designated latrines. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort. It was likely tied to religious purity, especially in ritual areas like temples or the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller cities in the ancient world, like Lothal and Harappa, reflect a deep understanding of hydrology, with wells, reservoirs, and strategically sloped streets to prevent flooding. Imagine planning an entire town with gravity and seasonal monsoons in mind, and then pulling it off in 2400 BCE. What makes all of this impressive isn't just the tech, it's the mindset. These civilizations viewed water not just as a necessity, but as something to be channeled, shared, and respected. Hygiene wasn't a luxury for the elite, it was embedded in the urban design itself. Modern cities still struggle with waste management. These ancients? They were already digging trenches and laying bricks, quietly reminding us that flushing is a civilizational achievement. If temples were where ancient people spoke to the gods, markets were where they negotiated with each other and likely argued over the price of onions. Every ancient city we've explored so far had a beating economic heart, and that heart pulsed in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and economic zoning. In Babylon, markets were not a chaotic afterthought squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban grid, and regulated by law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal texts, devotes dozens of clauses to trade practices, weights, measures, and merchant behavior. Markets bustled with activity under porticos and open-air squares, Grains, textiles, wine, slaves, and livestock changed hands while scribes tracked debts and transactions. This wasn't just shopping, it was commerce with legal infrastructure. Now shift to Teotihuacan, where things get even more fascinating. The city hosted enormous market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela complex, where thousands gathered to trade obsidian tools, cacao, feathers, ceramics, and salt. Unlike the highly centralized temple economies of some cultures, Teotihuacan's market system appeared decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in specific crafts. Think of it as an ancient version of local Etsy shops, except your supplier lived in the next compound. Meanwhile, in Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus cities, the urban layout reveals designated bazaar zones with wide avenues and adjacent warehouses. Archaeologists have uncovered standardized weights and scales, suggesting a robust system of regulation. Goods from as far away as Mesopotamia, including seals and precious stones, have been found in Indus sites, indicating that international trade was a thing. Imagine your neighborhood fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian currency and not even blinking. But it wasn't just about money. Markets were social hubs. In Babylon, they were places to catch gossip, settle disputes, and see who was wearing the latest Assyrian tunic. In Teotihuacan, they were multicultural melting pots, with traders and travelers from distant lands mingling among pyramids. Even the Indus cities, which lacked grand palaces or temples, prioritized economic zones in their design. Trade drove innovation. It demanded roads, regulation, and records. And ancient urban planners responded, not with chaos, but with structure. Behind every sacred temple or fortress wall, there was a merchant yelling, "Best price in the city." In the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts. It was about the gods. Temples weren't hidden in quiet corners. They dominated skylines, sat atop the city's highest points, and demanded prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone knew it. Start with Babylon. The skyline was pierced by the Etemenanke ziggurat, a multi-tiered mountain of baked brick dedicated to the god Marduk. It was no modest shrine. It was an architectural flex. Measuring around 91 meters high, if ancient sources are to be believed, it was meant to bridge heaven and earth. And this wasn't just spiritual, it was centralized urban messaging. Roads led to the temple, ceremonies revolved around it, and the entire city bowed, architecturally and ritually, to its divine core. Teotihuacan, too, placed its spiritual heart front and center. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ceremonial structures, they were urban anchors. The Avenue of the Dead connected these temples like a celestial path, aligning with astronomical events and possibly even solstices. Everything, from residential compounds to market spaces, seemed to radiate out from these temples. They weren't background props. They were cosmic coordinates, guiding both foot traffic and philosophy. And then there's Mohenjo-Daro, which didn't have towering ziggurats or pyramids, but instead gave us the Great Bath, a large public water tank likely used for ritual purification. This wasn't just a swimming hole, it was engineered with watertight bricks, a sophisticated drain system, and possibly linked to spiritual practices of cleanliness and rebirth. No idol-lined sanctuaries here, just water, geometry, and silence. In all these cities, sacred spaces were deliberately placed and functionally integrated. The temples weren't isolated, they were connected to processional roads, public courtyards, and administrative centres. Worship wasn't separate from life, it was life. Urban planning reflected this unity. These were not secular societies with temples, they were sacred landscapes disguised as cities. Every brick laid, every street carved, every plaza placed, was part of a larger spiritual choreography. Because in the ancient world, to build a city was to make an offering, and the gods always got the best seat in the house. It's tempting to think of modern cities as products of innovation, blueprints, and civil engineering degrees. But dig a little deeper. literally. And you'll find that the bones of urban life were laid thousands of years ago by planners without concrete, bulldozers, or CAD software. The DNA of city planning, grids, zoning, sanitation, civic centres, religious spaces, was already etched into the earth by people we often underestimate. Take drainage. Mohenjo-Daro didn't just throw down a few ditches. They designed an integrated, multi-level wastewater system that ran through homes and beneath streets. The concept of universal access to sanitation, still elusive in parts of the modern world, was a standard in this Bronze Age metropolis. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated commerce, civic infrastructure, and the symbolic use of space to reinforce power and religion. Teotihuacan gave us the template of the cosmic city, one where every road, plaza, and temple pointed to something bigger than the human eye could see. Its builders connected astronomy to architecture, embedding celestial rhythms into everyday movement. These weren't just settlements, they were philosophical blueprints. And then there's the psychological aspect. Ancient cities influenced behaviour. Wide avenues allowed for processions and parades. Enclosed courtyards created communal spaces. Zoning wasn't just practical, it shaped how people interacted, how neighbourhoods formed, and how authority was visualised. These choices told people where to gather, what was sacred, and how to live in harmony, or at least try. Modern urban planning owes much to this ancient foresight. Grids in Manhattan, sanitation in Amsterdam, temples turned into cathedrals turned into town halls. Even the idea of a civic centre comes from these ancestral cityscapes. We still measure property. We still design cities around access, trade, spirituality, and spectacle. What's changed is the technology, not the principle. And while we pave highways and erect skyscrapers, the core remains. Cities are stories we write in stone, brick, and steel. And the first chapters of that story? They were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. Hadrian was not born in the heart of Rome, but on its distant western fringe. He came into the world in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. Though geographically far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, elite, and thoroughly Roman in culture and ambition. Most importantly, his father's side was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the man who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both of his parents at around age 10, a formative tragedy that thrust him into the guardianship of Trajan and Publius Acilius Attianus, a Roman knight. These two men would shape the trajectory of his life. While many young nobles were steered toward military or political careers, Hadrian gravitated toward Greek literature, philosophy, and the arts. He spoke Greek fluently, read Homer obsessively, and preferred a scroll to a sword, at least early on. Rome, of course, didn't run on poetry, so Hadrian, as all ambitious Roman aristocrats did, had to earn his place through service. He began as a military tribune, first in Lower Moesia, then in Upper Moesia, and finally in Pannonia. He proved himself a competent officer, but his deeper talents lay in administration and statecraft. Trajan's rise to the emperorship in 98 CE marked a turning point for Hadrian. Though their relationship was sometimes strained, Hadrian was known for being sharp-tongued, arrogant, and a bit too intellectual for some. Trajan nonetheless kept him close. Hadrian became a quaestor, then tribune of the plebs, and steadily climbed the cursus honorum, Rome's ladder of political advancement. He also married well. His bride was Vibia Sabina, Trajan's grand niece, a politically strategic union, though not a happy one. The marriage was likely loveless and distant, as Hadrian's personal interests leaned more toward philosophical companionship and male intimacy especially in the case of his later beloved Antinous. Hadrian's early life was defined by this tension between military expectation and artistic temperament. He was a man from the edge of the empire, yet destined to lead it, not through brute force, but through calculated grace. In a world of conquest, he was already dreaming of marble columns and philosophical dialogue. When Emperor Trajan fell gravely ill in 117 CE, the question of succession became urgent and murky. Though Hadrian had long served in the imperial orbit, his claim to the throne wasn't universally accepted. Trajan had never publicly named a successor, and the political elite were divided over whether Hadrian, the aloof intellectual from Hispania, was truly the right man to lead Rome. Trajan died in Selinus, in Asia Minor, far from the capital. Conveniently or suspiciously within days, a letter arrived in Rome stating that Trajan had adopted Hadrian as his son on his deathbed, witnessed by Trajan's wife Plotina and the ever-loyal Attianus. The timing was impeccable. Some senators whispered forgery. Others suspected that Plotina had orchestrated the whole affair, favouring Hadrian's administrative mind over the more militaristic candidates.